Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When your own parents forget to invite you on the trip of a lifetime, the kind they promised for years, it doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like confirmation. Confirmation that maybe you've been right all along, that you're not really part of the main cast of your own family, just an extra who occasionally delivers coffee and vanishes before the credits roll. It happened on a Wednesday. I remember because I was eating leftovers, half watching the news, and trying not to care. My phone buzzed with a picture message from my mom, Dale and Marcia Harper, champions of the retirement bucket list. The photo showed them grinning on a massive balcony, arms draped around my older brother Eli like they were a damn cruise commercial. We made it. Mediterranean magic, here we come, with sparkles and a boat emoji. She always loved using emojis. Always loved showing off. I stared at the screen for a good 10 seconds, not quite processing what I was looking at. Maybe it was sent to the wrong group, I thought. But it wasn't. There was no mistake. There was no invitation. There was no phone call the week before. No heads up. Not even a half-assed, "We wish you could have joined us." They were gone. On a 10-day cruise. With Eli. Now, I need you to understand something. This wasn't just any cruise. This was the cruise. The one they'd been planning since Dad's second hip surgery, the one we all used to joke about back when I still came home for Thanksgiving. It was supposed to be for the whole family, a big send-off into their golden years, a moment we'd look back on together and laugh about over boxed wine and old family albums. But here they were, smiling in the sun, without me. I didn't text back right away. What would I even say? Looks great, wish I were there? That would have sounded passive-aggressive, and I didn't want to play games. The truth is, I didn't even feel angry. Just numb. Like I'd been watching a movie I wasn't really part of, and this was just the next scene where I sit quietly in the background while Eli does the talking, the toasting, the memory-making. Eli is the kind of person who could walk into a funeral and make people laugh. Charming, golden, the guy who always wins at charades and gets extra shrimp at the buffet. My parents always adored him, even when he dropped out of college for 2 years to figure things out. When I got divorced, my mom's first question was whether I had tried hard enough. When Eli got caught cheating on his second wife, they blamed the women for not understanding him. I used to tell myself I was okay with being the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who called once a week even when there was nothing to say, who sent birthday cards early, who fixed the back porch steps without being asked. But that Wednesday, something inside me shifted. Like a screw that had been a little loose for years, finally popped out and rolled under the couch. I didn't feel okay anymore. I clicked through the photo a second time, then a third. My father's hand rested on Eli's shoulder. My mother's face beamed like she was 20 again. The water behind them was sapphire blue, endless and perfect. I could hear the clink of glasses, the muffled jazz of a ship lounge, the faint hum of laughter, and not one sound had anything to do with me. I didn't answer the message that night. I didn't answer the next morning either. Instead, I went through my calendar and deleted all the reminders I'd set: Dad's cardiology appointment follow-up, Mom's garden club bake sale, Eli's daughter's piano recital. Stuff I'd added over time like some kind of unpaid assistant, just trying to be useful. Gone. All of it. At work. Nobody noticed anything. I still showed up, still did my job, still smiled when someone made a joke. I even brought donuts on Friday like always. That's the funny part, you can be completely shattered on the inside, and the world just keeps expecting you to refill the coffee pot. My parents didn't call. They probably assumed I was busy, or maybe they didn't think about me at all. Maybe that's the part that hurt the most. Not the exclusion, but the silence afterward. No explanation. No regret. Just seafoam and sunsets and smiling selfies. When the 10th day came, and I knew they were due to return, I rehearsed what I might say. I imagined them calling, laughing, saying, "We should have invited you, Nikki. It wasn't the same without you, and I'd forgive them, because that's what I always did. But they didn't call. Not that day. Not the next. I finally sent a text that said, "Glad you had fun. Hope it was worth it." They sent back a thumbs up. I wish I could say that was the moment I snapped, that it was dramatic and fiery and cinematic. But it wasn't. What happened next came on like fog, slow, quiet, and almost invisible. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself with a bang, but with a whisper you only hear when everything else finally goes silent. That's when I started making a list. Not a bucket list. A leaving list. Things to cancel. Things to sell. Things to pack. And a single question scribbled at the top in thick black ink. What would happen if I just disappeared? You'd be surprised how many family photos you can scroll through before you realize you're barely in them. I went digging late one night, after a second glass of wine and an overwhelming silence that felt heavier than it should have. I opened the folder on my computer called Family Stuff and started clicking. There they all were: birthdays, vacations, graduations, barbecues. Eli in the center, Eli blowing out the candles, Eli with his arm around Mom, or Dad, or both. I was usually on the edge of the frame, half smiling, holding someone's purse or plate or camera, my body turned slightly away like I already knew I didn't belong in the middle. I think the first time I really noticed the pattern, I was probably 12 or 13. Eli had just won some kind of student leadership award, I can't even remember what for, and my parents threw a backyard party that included balloons, cake, and a slideshow of his accomplishments. I'd gotten a perfect score on a math test that same week. I showed Mom the paper, grinning and proud, and she gave me a distracted "that's great, honey," before telling me to go help Dad set up chairs. That's how it was every time. My good moments were quiet footnotes. Eli's were chapters. Have you ever been the other child in your own family? Like you were loved, but only when it was convenient? Tell me in the comments. I want to know if I'm the only one who felt this way growing up. Eli was the kind of kid who could break a window and talk his way out of it by the time Dad finished yelling his name. He was charming in that golden boy way, confident without ever appearing cocky, funny without trying, the kind of person who made other people feel seen. Except me. He didn't mean to ignore me, not exactly, but he was always so used to being the center that he just assumed the spotlight belonged to him by default. And the rest of us, Mom, Dad, me, just kind of orbited around him like planets too small to have a say in our own path. I didn't resent him, not at first. It's hard to be angry at someone who doesn't realize they're standing in your sun. I wanted to be more like him for a long time. I even started playing baseball in 8th grade because he had done it. But I was never good. Couldn't hit, couldn't throw, didn't care. Dad came to one game, told me afterward I looked tense. That was the extent of his encouragement. When Eli failed out of college the first time, they paid for his apartment in the city while he figured himself out. When I got a full scholarship and quietly graduated with honors, Mom told people I worked hard, but made it sound like an accident. When Eli got married for the first time, it was a 300-person event with steak dinners and string quartets. When I got married, we had pot roast in a church basement, and my parents left before the dancing started because the drive home was too long. Looking back, it wasn't one big thing that broke me. It was 100 little cuts over decades, moments where I showed up and stayed quiet, and made sure the machine kept running, while Eli got praised for putting gas in the tank once a year. The thing about being the invisible one is that people start assuming you're fine. They think silence means stability, that not complaining means contentment. But silence can be a scream turned inward. And lately, mine had grown louder than I could stand. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and the family group chat on the screen. The last message was a picture from the cruise, Eli in a white polo, Mom in a wide-brimmed hat, Dad with his arm around both of them. They looked happy, whole, complete, like they hadn't even noticed one of their 3 chairs was empty. I clicked the 3 dots in the corner and selected Leave Chat. It asked me if I was sure. I clicked yes. It felt like nothing, and it felt like everything. Like I had just stepped out of a room I'd been locked in for years. Then I pulled out the same notebook I'd used to start my leaving list the week before. This time, I gave it a new title, What I Owe Them. I started writing down the names of every obligation I'd taken on that belonged to someone else, watering Mom's garden when they were away, checking on Dad's prescriptions, updating Eli's resume, fixing the goddamn fence last summer when he bailed last minute. I filled half a page, and then I drew a line through every one of them. That was the moment the fog I'd been living in started to clear. Not all the way, not yet, but enough for me to realize that if I didn't leave now, I might never remember what it felt like to exist for myself. And so I kept writing. Not just lists. Plans. Questions. Options. Where I might go. What I might become. Who I might be if I stopped living in someone else's shadow. I didn't know exactly where I was going yet. But for the first time in decades, I knew exactly where I wasn't. It started with the cabinets, the ones above the fridge that no one ever really uses unless they're hiding holiday platters or expired cans of soup. I stood on a chair one evening a week after deleting the family group chat, and I just started pulling things down. Not angrily, not even particularly fast. I wasn't in a rush, I wasn't spiraling. I just needed something to do with my hands while everything inside me slowly untangled into something unrecognizable. There were old coffee mugs from ex-girlfriends, mismatched glasses from garage sales, a fondue set I'd never used, and a dusty crockpot my mom gave me 5 Christmases ago, the same one she claimed was exactly like the one Eli uses. I put it in the donation box first. Then everything else followed. It wasn't just spring cleaning. This was something else. Something deeper. Like my body had decided, without asking my mind for permission, that it was done pretending things were fine. You can live a whole life surrounded by things you didn't choose, jobs, routines, objects, people, and only realize how heavy it all feels when you start removing them one by one. I went from cabinets to closets, then drawers, then my phone. I deleted over 400 contacts, including coworkers I barely spoke to, high school friends I hadn't seen since the Bush administration, and yes, even Eli. The group chat was already gone, but erasing his individual number felt cleaner. Like removing a puzzle piece that never really fit. No message, no explanation. Just delete. At night, I stopped turning on the TV. I let the quiet expand until it filled every corner of the apartment. And in that silence, I started hearing parts of myself I hadn't listened to in years. There was no dramatic music, no slow zoom in like in a movie, just me, sitting on the floor with 3 boxes labeled keep, donate, and who knows, and a sense that maybe I wasn't crazy after all. I started ignoring texts from coworkers. Not in a rude way, I just stopped responding. I didn't answer emails unless they were urgent. I turned off calendar notifications. I let dishes pile up and only did laundry when I ran out of socks. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't depressed. I was just pausing, like a machine that's been running nonstop for 42 years and finally gets unplugged. Sarah texted once, a simple, "Hey, you good?" And I almost replied, but I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like an apology. We hadn't talked much in the last year anyway, not since her dad died, and she moved back to that quiet little town upstate where cell service barely existed and people waved at each other from porches like it was 1968. She was one of the few people who ever really asked how I was without making it sound like a courtesy. I thought about her a lot during those quiet evenings, the way she once told me, years ago, that some people bleed loud and some bleed quiet. I didn't know what she meant back then. I do now. It's funny how nobody notices when a quiet person goes quieter. There's no big shift, no alarm bells, no "are you okay?" moments unless you break something or cry in public. And I was good at hiding. Always had been. I smiled just enough, nodded at the right times, made the same coffee run every Tuesday morning, and nobody ever stopped to ask if any of it was real. Then, on a Monday that looked like every other Monday, I walked into my office, put my badge on my boss's desk, and told HR I was done. No big speech, no drama, no 2 weeks. Just a typed letter and a box of stuff I'd already packed the night before. I didn't even take the stapler with my name on it. I walked out of that building like I was walking out of someone else's life. The sky was gray. The parking lot was half full. I didn't feel fear or relief or even uncertainty. I just felt blank. Like the first page of a notebook after you've torn out everything that came before it. 3 days passed before anyone from work called. When they finally did, it was Susan from accounting. "Hey, just checking, are you on vacation?" Or, that's when I knew for sure. I'd spent years filling a role that nobody really looked at, only noticed when it stopped functioning. I was a fixture, not a person. A coat rack in the corner of a room people passed every day without seeing. I didn't answer Susan's message. I turned off my phone that night and left it off for good. Somewhere in the bottom of a box marked "Who knows," it buzzed twice, then went quiet. And in that silence, something in me cracked, not like a window shattering, but like a seam pulling apart in fabric worn too thin. Not broken, exactly. Just no longer whole. And I wasn't sure yet if that was a bad thing. I left just before sunrise, the world still dark enough to keep me from being seen clearly, which was exactly the way I wanted it. There was no dramatic music playing in my head, no internal narration about second chances or starting over, only the low, steady hum of tires on pavement and the distant ache in my chest that felt neither good nor bad. Just hollow in a way I had grown to accept. I didn't leave a note on the fridge. I didn't forward my mail. I didn't text a single soul, not even Sarah, and not even out of guilt. Just silence. Like a final breath before vanishing underwater. I didn't even know where I was going at first, only that I had to be somewhere else. Somewhere not here. I took the smaller roads, the kinds that twist and dip between hills and dying farmland, the ones with faded billboards for gas stations that no longer exist and diner signs so sun-bleached you can barely read the names. I stopped once at a rest area around noon, an old brick building with a soda machine that still took quarters, and I watched a young couple argue in the parking lot. They were both too tired to yell properly, swatting at each other's words like flies, and I felt a strange kind of comfort watching them. At least they were seen. At least they mattered enough to fight. By the second day, I'd thrown out my phone charger at a gas station in Tennessee, not by accident, but on purpose. Something about the act felt final, like cutting a cord that had always kept me tethered to a version of myself I didn't recognize anymore. I let the battery die slowly over the next few hours, watching the percentage tick down with a sick kind of satisfaction. 17%. 12. 5. And then nothing. Just a blank screen and the sense that maybe, just maybe, I was finally becoming the ghost I had always been treated like. I ate when I was hungry, slept when the exhaustion became too heavy, and didn't bother keeping track of time. The world didn't seem to notice my absence, which confirmed something I'd suspected all along. I was always more useful than loved, more convenient than cared for. People miss what you do, not who you are. That's the kind of truth you can't really say out loud at Thanksgiving. It was on the 5th day that I found the town. Or maybe it found me. Either way, I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place that doesn't show up on GPS and doesn't need to. It had a main street with more dust than cars, 2 antique stores, a diner with peeling paint, and a general store that looked like it hadn't changed since 1963. The welcome sign leaned to one side and simply said Ridgeway in crooked metal letters. No slogan. No population count. Just the name, as if that was enough. I pulled the car into a gravel lot next to a faded laundromat, got out, and just stood there for a moment, letting the silence press into me like a warm hand on my chest. It wasn't peaceful exactly, but it was still. And stillness was something I hadn't felt in years. I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your ribs and pushes against every part of you that's still afraid, and I realized I didn't miss them. Not yet. Not in the way I thought I would. There was no pull toward my apartment, no phantom tug toward my phone, no ache to hear my name from a voice that had only ever used it to summon chores or guilt. I didn't feel free, not completely, but I felt untied. And that was something. I spent that first night in Ridgeway at a tiny roadside motel that smelled like old soap and pine disinfectant. The woman at the front desk barely looked up from her crossword when I handed over cash. She didn't ask for ID. She didn't ask where I'd come from or where I was going. She just handed me the key and pointed down the hall. Room 6. The lock stuck, the mattress sagged, the air conditioner groaned like a dying animal, and it was perfect. I sat on the bed and let the dead silence settle over me like dust. No texts, no emails, no reminders. The phone, now cold and useless in my bag, was just a relic of the life I used to live. I didn't throw it away, not yet, but I zipped it into the side pouch and told myself I'd decide what to do with it later. I kept thinking maybe I'd feel a wave of regret. Maybe I'd wake up the next morning and bolt, realizing I'd made some irreversible mistake. But the truth is, I didn't. I walked the streets of Ridgeway in the early light, past a dog sleeping in the doorway of the hardware store, past a group of old men drinking coffee on a bench like they'd been doing it for 40 years, and I felt, for the first time in my adult life, unaccounted for, unreachable, like a page torn from a book that didn't know how to end my story anyway. I don't know how long I'll stay here. Maybe a week. Maybe a year. Maybe I'll just keep moving until the urge to explain myself finally dies for good. But as I stood at the edge of that dusty road, watching the sunlight fall in long gold slants across a town that didn't care who I was or why I was here, I felt something loosen in my chest. The weight of being needed. The itch of being known. The hollow ache of waiting for someone to call just to ask, "Are you okay?" And in that stillness, with my phone dead and my past shrinking in the rearview mirror, I heard it clearly, the sound of nothing calling me forward. The town of Ridgeway didn't ask questions, and for a while that was exactly what I needed. Days blended into each other without any sense of urgency, like time had been diluted into something soft and slow, something without edges. I started walking every morning just after the sun rose, following the gravel path behind the diner that led toward a line of trees nobody seemed to bother naming. The air smelled like wet earth and wood smoke, and the silence wasn't empty. It was full of subtle sounds I hadn't noticed in years, like the crunch of dry leaves or the click of birds' wings slicing the air above me. I was beginning to understand that quiet wasn't the absence of noise, it was the presence of something else entirely, something I hadn't had in my life since I was a kid. One morning, I found myself sitting on a bench in front of the town's only bookstore, a narrow little place tucked between the hardware store and a florist that only seemed to sell carnations. I was drinking bad coffee from a paper cup and watching a man sweep his porch across the street when I heard a familiar voice say my name, not my full name, not Nicholas, which only my mom used when she was mad, but Nick said softly like a memory. I turned and saw her, Sarah, standing with one hand in the pocket of a denim jacket, the other holding a set of keys. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, a little windblown, and her face had the kind of tired kindness that doesn't come from sleep, but from having survived something quietly. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but in that moment, it felt like we'd never stopped. She sat down beside me without asking, the way she always used to do back when we'd sit on her porch drinking gas station wine and talking about books we never finished. For a minute, we didn't say anything, just looked at the street like it might offer up some kind of explanation. Finally, she asked, "So, Ridgeway?" as if the town itself was a question. I told her the truth, or at least a version of it. That I'd left without telling anyone, that I was tired of being a placeholder in my own life, that I didn't know how long I'd stay. I didn't mention my parents or Eli by name. I didn't have to. She knew enough about that part of my story to fill in the blanks, and she'd never been one to press for more than you were ready to give. We ended up walking to her house, a small bungalow on the edge of town with chipped white paint and a wind chime that sounded like distant laughter. Inside, the place was warm and cluttered, filled with stacks of used books and mismatched mugs and the faint smell of cinnamon. It looked lived in, but not in the way my old apartment did. It looked claimed, like every inch of it had been touched and chosen and loved. That night, we sat on her porch wrapped in blankets, sipping tea she swore would help me sleep. I told her things I hadn't said out loud in years about the silence that had become my second language, about the way my parents had slowly stopped seeing me even when I was right in front of them, about the funeral I once attended where I felt more visible than I ever had at any family dinner. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice. She just listened, which is a rarer kind of love than people think. At some point, the conversation drifted into something lighter. Memories of the time we tried to bake a pie and ended up setting off the smoke alarm. Stories about the weird guy who used to run the gas station and claimed he'd been abducted by aliens twice. The way we used to sit in the back of that old pickup truck and name the stars after terrible rock bands. And for the first time in what felt like decades, I laughed. Not the kind of polite, low chuckle I'd perfected over years of pretending, but a real, unfiltered laugh that came from someplace deep inside me I thought had gone dormant. There's something dangerously comforting about being with someone who remembers the parts of you that existed before life wore you down. Sarah remembered who I was before I became someone else's backup plan. She remembered when I still wrote poetry in cheap notebooks and believed in road trips without GPS and thought forgiveness was something you didn't have to earn. We stayed up until the porch light flickered and the crickets grew louder, talking about nothing and everything the way only old friends can. Eventually, the conversation fell into silence, not the uncomfortable kind, but the sort that feels like rest. I looked out at the road, half expecting my guilt to come crawling back up my spine like it always did. But it didn't. Not that night. Before I left, as I was standing on her front step, she looked at me in that quiet, piercing way she has, and said, "Do they even know you're gone?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Because that's the thing about disappearing, not everyone notices when you do it slowly enough. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to be found. The suitcases thumped onto the tile floor with the kind of heavy finality that follows a long trip, the kind where your legs feel like jelly and your brain still thinks it's on a boat. Dale Harper exhaled hard as he pushed the front door closed behind him, a gust of warm suburban air greeting him like an old, unwelcome dog. The cruise had been nice, or at least that's what they kept telling themselves. The wine was bottomless, the sunsets were staged perfectly every evening, and Eli had made friends with everyone in their dinner group by the second night. But now that they were home, a strange silence crept in around the edges of the house, something they couldn't name just yet, but would soon be forced to confront. Marcia stood in the foyer for a moment, scanning the house with a confused kind of anticipation, like she expected it to feel different or cleaner or maybe more full of life after being gone so long. She had texted Nick 3 times during the trip, once when they reached the port in Italy, once when Dale slipped during a hike and cut his elbow, and once just to ask if he'd remembered to check their mail, but he hadn't responded. She'd told herself he was probably busy or maybe just unplugging for a while. He did that sometimes. He was one of those quiet types, she liked to say to friends, like it was some charming little flaw, a quirk to be tolerated rather than understood. Eli was the first to notice something off. He walked into the kitchen and looked around, sniffing the air like something had spoiled. "Did Nick come by at all?" he asked casually, opening the fridge and finding it half empty. "Looks like no one's been here in weeks." Marcia frowned, glancing around the living room where a stack of newspapers sat untouched and the answering machine blinked with a red light. Dale waved it off with a grunt and said maybe Nick had just been lazy about things, or maybe he forgot they were even gone. "You know how he gets," he added, as if Nick's withdrawal from the family was some kind of seasonal allergy. But even Eli, the golden sun with charm oozing from every pore, started to look uneasy. He walked upstairs and peeked into the guest room where Nick sometimes stayed if he was too tired to drive home after dinner. The bed hadn't been slept in. The drawer where he kept a spare toothbrush was empty. And when Eli opened the closet, the only thing inside was a single dry cleaning bag from 2 years ago that nobody had bothered to throw out. They started calling then, all three of them. Dale from the landline, Marcia from her phone, Eli pacing the porch while sending half-panicked texts. No answer. No read receipts. Just voicemail, again and again. Hey buddy, it's Dad. Just checking in. Give us a call when you get this. Nick, it's Mom. Are you okay? We just got back. Call me. Dude, this is getting weird. Where are you? By nightfall, the silence had curdled into something bitter and sharp. Marcia started to cry, softly at first, the kind of tears that sneak out before you even realize you're scared. Dale muttered something about calling the neighbors, but none of them had seen Nick for weeks. Not since before the cruise. No one had seen his car. No one had heard him come or go. It was like he'd evaporated. It was Eli, surprisingly, who finally said the thing they had all been avoiding. He stood in the living room, his face pale and unreadable, and said, "I don't think he's missing. I think he left." Marcia blinked at him like he'd spoken in another language. Left where? I don't know, Eli replied, and for the first time in years, he looked less like the brother who always had the right answer and more like a boy who realized too late that he'd been playing the wrong game. But I think he's gone on purpose. Dale scoffed, almost laughed, like the idea was absurd, but something in his eyes betrayed a deeper uncertainty. He wouldn't just disappear. He's not that kind of person. Eli's voice was flat when he responded. No, he's exactly that kind of person. You just never noticed. There was a long silence after that. The kind that makes you look at the people you thought you knew and start seeing ghosts behind their faces. Dale sat down in his chair, suddenly looking 10 years older. Marcia clutched her phone like it might ring if she stared hard enough. And Eli paced, staring at the floor as if trying to solve a riddle where all the clues had been burned. Eventually, they called the police, which felt more like a formality than a solution. The officer who showed up was polite but tired, clearly used to people freaking out over nothing. How long has he been gone? He asked, and the silence that followed was so long it might as well have been a confession. Nobody knew. Nobody could remember the last time they'd actually seen Nick, not just on a screen or in a thread, but in real life, breathing, speaking, being. He's not missing, Eli said again, softer this time, like he was still trying to convince himself. He just didn't want to be found. They filed the report anyway. They gave a photo. They listed his car, his height, his last known address. But when the officer left and the door shut behind him, the house felt no less empty, no less haunted by everything they hadn't said, hadn't noticed, hadn't done. That night, Marcia sat on the edge of her bed and asked a question she hadn't said out loud in over 20 years. Did we do something wrong? And across the hall, Dale didn't answer. Because for the first time in his life, he honestly didn't know. There's something about putting thoughts on paper that makes the truth settle heavier than when it's just floating around in your head. Words feel sharper, more permanent, when they're dragged across the page in ink. You can't deny what's been written once you see it staring back at you in your own handwriting, in that strange, familiar scrawl you've used your entire life for grocery lists, birthday cards, and rent checks. It's yours, but somehow it doesn't always feel like it belongs to you once the truth starts pouring out. I started writing the first letter 3 days after I realized I had stopped counting how long I'd been in Ridgeway. Time in that town didn't move like it did everywhere else. It sagged and stretched, like heat on a quiet highway in late July. I found a used notebook in the bottom drawer of the nightstand at the motel, half filled with someone else's crossword puzzles and a recipe for chicken and dumplings that looked like it was copied from a church bulletin. I tore those pages out and started fresh. The first letter was to my mother. It began stiffly, like I was writing a thank you note for a gift I didn't like, but had to pretend I appreciated. Dear Mom, I wrote, and paused for a long time after that. What do you say to someone who always made you feel like you were one wrong opinion away from being an inconvenience? I told her about the town, about Ridgeway's crooked signs. its lazy afternoons, the way the sun fell through the trees like it was trying to apologize for something. I told her I was okay. I lied a little, but mostly I told her things I'd never had the courage to say face to face. I wrote about how it felt to sit at a table while she gushed over Eli, how I'd learned to keep my victories quiet so they wouldn't seem like I was competing. I didn't accuse her of anything directly. I just wrote the truth as I remembered it, line by line, until the pen started shaking in my hand. Then I folded the page, slid it into an envelope I never sealed, and placed it in the drawer beside the bed. The next letter was for my father. That one came faster, almost violently so, like the words had been waiting at the edge of my throat for decades and finally found an escape route. I told him I remembered every time he called Eli, the man of the house, even though I was standing right there, every time he said, "You'll understand when you're older," and then never followed up when I got older and still didn't understand a damn thing. I wrote about the time I fixed the back porch in 95-degree heat while he sat inside watching golf and later thanked Eli for getting it done. I didn't expect an apology, not even in my imagination. But I wanted him to know I'd seen it all, that even when I didn't say anything, I noticed everything, especially the silences. Then came Eli's letter. That one I rewrote 3 times. At first, I tried to be civil, to give him the benefit of the doubt. But every sentence came out fake, coded in a politeness I didn't owe him. So I scrapped it. The second draft was angry, full of bitterness I wasn't sure belonged entirely to him. But the third attempt was honest. I told him he won. He always won. Every conversation, every Christmas, every unspoken contest between siblings where love was the prize and I was always the runner-up. I wrote that I didn't hate him, I just couldn't be near him anymore. Not when he could walk through life with a spotlight that wasn't built for 2. I told him I hoped he never had to feel invisible. And I meant that. Because no one should have to feel like a ghost while their family applauds someone else's echo. Every letter ended with a name, my name, written with a hand that was steadier than I expected it to be. Not because I was at peace, exactly, but because saying it out loud on paper, in ink, was like stitching a wound shut, even if it still bled underneath. I kept the letters in the drawer for a while. I reread them every few nights, not because I planned to send them, but because it reminded me that I hadn't imagined it all. That my pain wasn't a product of thin skin or childhood jealousy. It was real. It had roots. And for once, I had proof that I didn't need anyone else's permission to feel it. Then, one night, the air turned sharp and cold, the kind of cold that smells like something ending. I built a small fire behind the motel, behind the row of dumpsters no one ever seemed to empty, and I brought the letters with me in a shoebox. No one watched. No one asked questions. Ridgeway didn't concern itself with explanations. I opened the envelopes one by one, unfolded each letter slowly, and fed them to the fire. The paper curled and blackened like old photographs, the words lifting into the night air as ash and smoke. I didn't feel lighter and I didn't feel healed. But I felt something shift inside me, like I'd finally said what needed saying, even if no one would ever hear it. Because some things are too honest to share. Some truths are only meant for the one who lived them. And sometimes, the only person who needs to know what you went through is you. The motel room smelled like old dust and cold coffee, and the radiator kept clicking like it was struggling to remember how to work. Outside, the trees swayed in a lazy kind of way, like they had nowhere to be and no one to impress. I'd been in Ridgeway long enough that the lady at the diner stopped asking for my name when I came in for coffee, and the man who ran the bookstore started holding aside paperbacks he thought I'd like, even though we'd never exchanged more than a few words. It wasn't a life, exactly. It was more like an intermission. A pause I hadn't known I needed until I was halfway through it. Sarah came by some nights, usually after her shift at the clinic, and we'd sit on the porch outside the motel and talk about everything except the future. She was the only person who didn't ask what I planned to do next. Maybe she understood better than most that sometimes the only plan worth having is not to have one at all. Some nights we talked, some nights we didn't, and the silence between us was never heavy or awkward. It just was. Like wind or dusk or the crackle of a far-off radio playing a song neither of us could name. I hadn't turned my phone on in weeks, maybe months. I stopped counting after the first snowfall dusted the tops of the trees like powdered sugar. But that morning, for reasons I still can't explain, I opened the drawer where I'd stuffed it the night I arrived. The battery had long since died, but I plugged it in and watched the screen flicker back to life. There were dozens of missed calls, a handful of texts from unknown numbers, 2 voicemails, and one of them was from Eli. I didn't press play right away. I just stared at the notification like it was something poisonous, something fragile and ticking. I stepped outside into the cold, let the wind hit my face, and stood there with the phone in my hand until the numbness in my fingers reminded me I was still alive. When I finally played the message, Eli's voice filled the quiet in a way that made something in my chest contract, sharp and sudden. He sounded tired. Not just physically, but somewhere deeper than that, like his soul had been walking barefoot over glass for weeks. "Hey," he said. "Nick. It's me. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and maybe you won't even get this, but I had to try." There was a pause. I heard him exhale like he was bracing for impact. "Dad's not doing great. He's been in and out of the hospital. Mom's a wreck. She barely eats. She cries at night, says she keeps dreaming you're sitting in the kitchen, just staring at her and not saying anything." Another pause, longer this time, like he was waiting for me to interrupt, though we both knew I couldn't. "I know we weren't close. I know I took up too much space. I get that now, maybe too late. But they're not the same without you. Hell, I'm not the same without you." Something cracked in his voice then, something I hadn't heard since we were kids, and he broke his arm falling off the garage roof. I need you to come back, man. Not for them. For me. For whatever's left." He ended the message with a soft please, like a whisper you only say when no one else is around to hear you beg. I stood there for a long time after the voicemail ended. The phone felt hot in my hand, like it was burning through all the excuses I'd made for staying gone. There was a part of me that wanted to believe it, wanted to believe they missed me, needed me, saw me. But there was another part, louder and more honest, that remembered what silence felt like when I was standing in the room and no one even turned their head. Sarah came by that night with 2 paper cups of soup and sat beside me on the curb in front of the motel. I didn't tell her about the message. I didn't have to. She watched my face for a long time, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable in that way only people who've been hurt and healed and hurt again can manage. She handed me the soup and said nothing. I went back inside and stared at the phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. I could have called back. I could have texted. I could have said I was coming home. Instead, I held the phone over the trash can and hit delete. Not angrily. Not with any sense of revenge or spite. Just stillness. Like finishing a book that never really knew how to end and deciding to write your own last chapter. I didn't disappear because I hated them. I disappeared because I finally realized they never really saw me. So I gave them exactly what they treated me like, a ghost. Whether I made the right choice or not, I honestly don't know. Some mornings I wake up and wonder what would have happened if I had answered. If I had come back. If I had given them one more chance to prove me wrong. And some mornings I sit on Sarah's porch, watching the sun rise over a town that never asked anything from me except to exist, and I feel freer than I've ever felt in my life. Maybe someday I'll go back. Maybe I won't. But for now, I've chosen something no one ever gave me the permission to choose before. I chose myself.